thoughts and opinions expressed in this podcast belong to the speakers and are not reflective of any organization. The content presented here is for general information purposes and should not be construed as advice.
Welcome back to Animal Introspective, the podcast all about animal well-being and the well-being of the people who care for them. We're your hosts. I'm Stephanie.
And I'm Grace, and today we're very excited to welcome Dr. Erica Feuerbacher. She is a board-certified behavior analyst, certified professional dog trainer, and associate professor of applied animal welfare and behavior in the School of Animal Sciences at Virginia Tech. She teaches students about learning, behavior, and welfare of animals, especially focusing on dogs and horses. And her research focuses on what maintains the human-dog relationship and how animals learn and how best we can train them. So hi, Erica. We are so excited to speak with you today. So first thing, I'm so curious, what was a moment that sparked your passion in applied companion animal behavior?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. It's fun to chat with both of you. Probably like you and much of your audience, I was, an animal child growing up where I acquired as many animals as possible, and my parents were incredibly indulgent. So we had goats and horses and rabbits and pigeons and dogs and cats and parrots and everything I could bring home. They were pretty nice. And that was just what I loved. I was in 4-H and I just loved showing my animals and working with them. And I went to undergrad at Arizona State and majored in biology. Again, because I loved animals and nature and things like that, but I wasn't really sure what to do with that. I didn't really want to go to vet school. That didn't seem like my path. I got involved in undergraduate research with honeybees at Arizona State and ended up going to graduate school at Berkeley for a few years in integrative physiology, studying flight dynamics in insects. And while I am still a big fan of the pollinators, it turns out that's not my dying passion. And at the same time, I gifted myself for graduation from ASU a working line German Shepherd puppy. And when I was at Berkeley, that's what I really focused on, probably to the chagrin of my then advisor. I was just fascinated by training her. We got involved in competitive agility, and I loved it. I loved figuring out how best to train her, how I could be a better partner for her, how I could be better out on the agility field, because if we screwed up, it was always me, never her. So I just loved that. And at some point I realized that when I go home, I was supposed to be reading about fluid dynamics, and I was reading about dog learning and behavior. And that's when I really realized I'm in the wrong field. I am passionate about companion animals and I love this field of learning. And so that's when I kind of switched. I started working at a humane society, Peninsula Humane Society. It was then in San Mateo, California, in the behavior department. I was really lucky with that. And then from there, just started doing more dog training, became, as you mentioned, a certified professional dog trainer. And eventually I went to a Clicker Expo and met Dr. Jesus Rosales Ruiz, who still is at the University of North Texas, and they have a master's degree in behavior analysis, and most of his work focuses on applied animal work. And that was when I realized that there was really a science to this, and I had been wanting to go back to graduate school, that was my academic path. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's this field and it fits perfectly with what I'm passionate about. So that's how I really got into it. And from there, headed off after I graduated from there, University of Florida with Clive Wynne. And then I've been lucky that at every step, when I'm not sure if there's going to be another door opening where I can continue dog work, there has been one. And so I've been really lucky that way.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I feel like a lot of us start in one direction and then find something that opens our eyes, and then we pivot, which I always love those origin stories.
Yes. Yeah. Figuring out what sparks those changes and the directions that you want to move into your new career.
Yeah. And I liked what you said about the open doors that come your way. 'Cause I've experienced that too of I don't quite know where I'm going to go next. And then an opportunity pops up, and having that open mind of saying yes to things and being brave to keep pursuing what you want to pursue.
Yeah, I think that's good, because it's tempting to say, well, I'm going to go the safe route, the one that I know will have these certain opportunities for me. And every time I kept coming back to but I love my dogs. I really want to study dogs. And that's what I, continued to do. So yeah, I think it's, it's good to find your passion. When I give career lectures at Virginia Tech to undergrads, I bring up Joseph Campbell's Follow Your Bliss, and because I'm a behaviorist, I switch it to Follow Your Reinforcers, and I think that's that's important to try and identify them. But I think our field, right, is not, it is becoming more mainstream, but back when I was younger, it really wasn't. So when I said I want to do something with companion animals, it was like, well, vet school, right? What else could you do? And I think the behavior and welfare, both in zoological settings and certainly with companion and other, equine species, that's being seen more, earlier on for folks to see that as a career path. So that's exciting, because I think otherwise you're like, I didn't even know this was there, right? I didn't know you could do this.
So you mentioned reinforcers just now, and a lot of your research kind of builds off of reinforcements and focusing on analyzing the efficacy of different reinforcement methods for different animals and how to train them. For those who may not be familiar, what would be the most basic definition of a reinforcer?
Sure, yeah. A reinforcer is a stimulus, so some environmental event that follows a behavior. And it has the effect on that behavior that it makes that behavior more likely in the future. So, if you give your dog a carrot after it sits and it does not increase your dog's likelihood of sitting in front of you, then that carrot was not a reinforcer. And so, every once in a while folks will say, well, I tried positive reinforcement and it didn't work. And that positive reinforcement by definition works. That just means you haven't found the environmental event that is reinforcing to your animal.
And how do you go about determining what that best reinforcer is for those different animals?
Yeah, so in our field, we have several different sort of assessments you can do this, and these are more formal that we use in research to make sure that we have good experimental control. But you can run these kind of more, and I'll tell you about them informally at your house too, to find out what your animal's like. One is a preference assessment. So there are different types of preference assessments. You could give your dog an array of toys and then let them in the room and see which one they go to first, or the one that they play with the most. And that would indicate probably a preference, at least in this moment, for that toy. We've done a lot with food. And so we'll give dogs different food items. And we usually do what's called a paired stimulus preference assessment, where we have a piece of food in each hand. We let them sniff, make sure they know what's available to them, and then we open our hands. We see which one they eat first. Some dogs have a side bias, they just go to the right all the time. And so in our more formal tests, we make sure we counterbalance, so that if hot dogs were here and Cheerios were here, then on another trial, hot dogs were here and Cheerios are in the other hand. And then you can just count up how many times your dog selected each item. And we've had good success with this, that we get kind of a hierarchy of preference in our dogs, that, they really like something and they really don't like this other, and then there's some middle bits. That's a preference assessment, but then we can take that further and say, well, is this really a valuable reinforcer? Meaning, are you going to work for it? And when we think about a valuable reinforcer, we think of things that produce quick behaviors, so that when I say sit, your dog is like, boom, bottom on the ground, right? Or you recall and they come right back. Whatever you've been using to maintain that behavior is probably a pretty valuable reinforcer if you're getting really quick responses. We might also ask the dog to do a lot of those responses, or whatever animal you're working with. And if they will continue to work to get that item, that suggests it's a really valuable reinforcer as well. So in some of our assessments, we'll do something called a progressive ratio test, where, like our dog, we usually do a simple behavior, like the dog coming up and touching their nose to our hand. We start off by, they touch their nose to our hand once, they get their treat. Then they have to do it twice, treat. Now they have to do it 3 times, then 4 times, then 5 times. So we keep adding on the number of responses they have to make. And at some point, the dogs say, you know what, that food is not worth it to me. You're asking me to touch your hand 18 times, not worth it. I've got better things to do with my time. But what we see is that our preference assessments, which are much simpler, actually line up really well with our reinforcer assessments. So if your dog prefers a certain item in the preference assessment, it's quite likely that it's going to be a more valuable reinforcer in that reinforcer assessment as well. We have a paper in progress, or a research study in progress, where we're asking, do we need to be able to do that formal preference assessment to know what our dogs prefer? And so the setup for that is we just give dogs food and we video record them. Separately, I have done a formal preference assessment and a formal reinforcer assessment. So I know kind of what they, prefer in a very structured environment. And then we give those videos of them just eating food to people to watch and say, can you tell which the dogs prefer? And actually they're doing a pretty good job. So I think those preference assessments, while valuable for research, if you know your animal, you can probably tell what things your dog really likes or what things your dog is not so keen on pretty readily. I think the fun thing to do is just to try new things. Sometimes we get stuck in our little ruts of what we give our dog as treats. And, I think that's one of the benefits of these preference assessments is it forces you out to try let's try deli meats. Let's try cooked chicken. Let's try all these different things. Then you can really see things that your dog is just gaga over.
That's great. I feel like that's such a big part of animal training and something that I know even in the zoo field, we struggle with sometimes with kind of some food limitations and other reinforcer limitations that you might have if an animal has a very specific diet for different reasons, that it can sometimes be a little hard to keep the creativity going with finding new reinforcers or what's actually the most reinforcing thing that you could give that animal, especially when we're training for a lot of medical husbandry behaviors, right? And the kind of conditions under that behavior might be a little bit more stressful or uncomfortable for the animal, but it's important for them to participate in so that they can have really good medical care. Finding something that's really reinforcing, that reinforcement doesn't taper off over time of kind of experiencing the behavior repeatedly and deciding that maybe it's not quite worth what that reinforcer is.
Yeah, for sure. And of course, food isn't the only reinforcer. So I'm curious, in the companion animal world, say for instance for dogs, what has been an interesting non-food reinforcer that you've discovered with a learner?
Yeah, so the main ones we've assessed so far are different food items and also social interaction. So I'll tell you about social interaction, and then there are other ones that I think we really ought to assess. They're a little more challenging to figure out how to control because you have to retrieve it's mostly toys, right? But in that we have to figure out how do we retrieve the item from the dog to start another trial. But I think that is probably our other really highly competitive reinforcer top reinforcer for a lot of our dogs is play. Certainly not all dogs, but there are a lot of dogs that would, probably starve themselves to death because they want to play with their toy rather than eat. We haven't assessed that, but I think that's hopefully in our future to try and dig into. The social interaction is the one we've also assessed. And while we have found that it functions as a reinforcer for dogs, it is typically not as valuable for dogs as food. And they likely satiate on it a little bit faster than food, whereas for a lot of dogs, they're almost like empty holes, right, for food. They can continue to eat and eat. But with social interaction, they probably satiate, they get kind of bored with it a little bit faster. And because it's not as valuable, you're not going to be able to use it for really high effort behaviors or behaviors where you're out at the park and you're having to compete with that squirrel. You're probably not going to be the funnest thing in town. But certainly at home, social interaction is important and can be a useful reinforcer there.
So your research has also used combinations of both behavioral observations, like what we were just talking about of observing which food your dog might eat first, but then also physiological measurements to infer an animal's internal mental state. So what are some of those physiological measures that we can use to determine what an animal might be experiencing on the inside?
Yeah, so we, like you said, we have our behavioral measures, which are kind of overt, which you can see. But of course, it might not tell us the whole story because dogs might be experiencing something internally the same way, but showing it differently externally, right? You might have a dog that is really nervous and is just flying off the walls and can't settle. And then you have another dog that's really nervous and is just almost catatonic and not moving at all. So it can be helpful to try and get a fuller picture of what our animals are experiencing by taking a look both at the behavior and the physiology. So with the physiology, we've oftentimes turned to cortisol, which is a stress hormone. It does not tell us whether the dog's having good stress or bad stress. So you can think about this. If you were had an exam tomorrow, that's probably bad stress. But if somebody said you're going to take a trip to Australia tomorrow, you might also be stressed getting ready for it, but it might be good stress, right? Like, this is really exciting. Your cortisol would go up in both of those situations. So that's where kind of the behavior comes in to see, like, okay, is this something you're excited about and you want, or is this something that you're like nervous and would prefer to avoid? So we oftentimes use cortisol, and in many of our studies, we have used urinary cortisol. So we go around with a little stick behind the dogs, take them for a morning walk, and collect urine and send it off, and we get a cortisol creatinine ratio that helps us account for how concentrated the urine is. And so from that, we've been able to look at the welfare states, mostly of shelter dogs. And in some of our research, we found that co-housing dogs, so putting them with a friendly partner in their kennel, can reduce their urinary cortisol. We also see behavioral benefits where they show fewer stress behaviors when they're paired up with another friend in a kennel rather than being kenneled alone. And then some of the work that Dr. Lisa Gunter and I have done looking at fostering, we see that there are benefits to getting the dog out of the shelter, that their cortisol significantly decreases. There are other measures we can use. In fact, one of my doctoral students, Sally Dickinson, is pursuing this currently. She is a search and rescue dog handler, and her research falls mostly in the working dog domain. She's looking at heart rate variability, heart rate and respiration as other measures that tell us about the animal's experience. So there's a growing list of things we can try and measure. It's just a matter of getting our technology up to be able to measure what we want to.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about like the future of what it may hold. So how might you think the findings of these increased physiological measures and increasing the technology might impact behavior management and training like in the future?
Yeah, I'm really hoping that we get things that give us more information about animals in real time. So for example, even in our physiology studies, right, we collect the urine and we send it off, and a month later we get the results from the lab. That's not really going to help, boots on the ground that need to serve the animal right now. That's why we oftentimes turn to behavioral measures in real time, right? Because we can see hopefully what the animal is experiencing. So I think one of the things we want to do is really get a better idea of what behaviors align with certain physiological states so that we can say, oh yeah, if that dog is engaging in that stereotypic behavior or lip licking or whatever, it is likely, this is how it's likely feeling, and we can try and address that early on. So I think that's one of the things we want to do is really try and figure out which behaviors are really telling for us. Which ones can we use as good markers to say this animal needs, more enrichment or is having a hard time coping in this environment. So I think that's one of them. The other is, could we start to take those other measures like heart rate variability, like respiration, in real time? And certainly there are, at least in the companion animal world, there are collars like they're like doggy Fitbits, like Pet Pace, that try and collect those data. And I think there's still some refinement to be done there. But I think it's moving in that way where we can start to measure some of those behaviors or some of those physiological responses in real time. It could be helpful. And then the other is, can we get some machine learning going, some AI to help us categorize our animal's behavior? We're all busy and we can't be watching the animal all the time. And so it'd be really useful if we could set up a video camera and it could tell us like, hey, this animal's resting more than it's usually resting, or it's been pacing, or, it doesn't lay down on one side. Maybe that indicates some pain. So I think those are some things we'd love to get to help us better serve our animals.
Yes, very interesting.
Yeah, that would be amazing. I can't even imagine how helpful that would be in so many different fields, and even with your pets at home, to just know more about the state that your animal is actually in and what it's experiencing in its life.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. And more we're seeing, not entirely, but a lot of pain issues being associated with behavioral issues. And your dog might not even look like it's in pain, right? You don't see an obvious limp, but there could be something else going on, GI upset, or a headache or something that you're not necessarily going to see overtly. That if we can get in there and treat it, sometimes those the dog feels better, and some behavioral issues might be mitigated as well.
Certainly, yeah.
So you've worked with dogs, horses, lots of different domesticated species. What do you think is one of the most interesting differences that you've found between how these different species approach learning?
I think one of the things we always have to keep in mind is sort of their ethology. So we've done, some of my students have done some cat training, and you oftentimes have more limited sessions with a cat. And if we look at how they usually eat, they're grazers, right? They eat a little and then they go off and do something else. And so that's really different than like our horses that just most of the day is spent, eating. And so when we work with cats, oftentimes our sessions are shorter, whereas with the dog, we might be able to go longer. When we've worked with horses, they have kind of blown dogs out of the water in terms of their willingness to work for very little food and their willingness to work for long periods of time. One of my doctoral students, who's now graduated, was looking at different grains as reinforcers for horses. And she was doing the same thing where the horse had to touch its nose to a target, and we increased the number of times it had to touch its nose to a target. And she came back to lab meeting after she was working on this, and she said, they won't stop. She's giving them just a little handful of grain. She's like, I can't get them to what we call the break point, where they stop responding, where they say, what, the grain I'm getting is not worth this. We actually had to have the target on one end of the stall, and for the next response, we moved it to the other end of the stall, so they had to walk back and forth to touch the target. So we made the response a lot more effortful, and only then could we get to break points. Those horses were just, kind of what we call, anthropomorphizing workaholics, right? They just keep going. And I found that with my own horse, who's clicker trained, that he is eager to keep learning and learning and working and working. And some of our other animals, have different tolerances for how long they'll work.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I can imagine that would be such a big influence on teaching all these different learners, is that figuring out how they would naturally receive reinforcements in the wilds from their environment and their food and all those things.
Yeah, certainly. And then also factoring in those individual differences, right? Because I'm sure there are those cats that will be those workaholics, and then there are those horses that are like, I want nothing to do with whatever you have to give me. And so that's also another interesting challenge. And what makes having that relationship with animals so interesting, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. And this is where, our observational skills are so important, where you start to, you see precursor behaviors like, oh, they're getting a little fidgetier, or they're taking a little longer to respond. And in the past, this has always meant that they're kind of done and we're not going to get any more kind of forward progress in this session. It's best to wrap it up. So I agree. It's like you really have to listen to your learner. And I think that's an important part of what we do is I might want you to get to X point. I maybe want you to be able to hold a nose target for 30 seconds. But if you can only do it for 10 seconds and you're petering out in my training session, then, we're just not going to get there. And we really have to align our training with our learners' needs rather than what we would hope would happen.
So we just talked about so much interesting information with all the work that you have done over the course of your career. So for the people out there who are interested in working in animal behavior, can you tell us a little bit more about being a board-certified behavior analyst and a certified applied animal behaviorist, and kind of what's the difference and how do you achieve those certifications?
Sure. So I'll start off with the Certified Applied Animal Behaviorist. That is a designation that is given by the Animal Behavior Society. We have CABs, so that the Certified Applied Animal Behaviorist, and you have to have a PhD for that. We also have ACABs, which are Associate Certified Applied Animal Behaviorists, and that requires a master's degree. It's the one certification in the United States, other than, say, veterinary behaviorists, that requires academic training to hold it. Along with that degree, you have to have courses in 30 hours of animal behavior related content. And those are actually divided up into two different kind of lines of knowledge. One is learning theory, reinforcement, punishment, things like that, and biological bases of behavior. And the other is sort of ethology, cognition. And so you have to have at least 9 credits of coursework in each of those domains, and overall 30 credits in animal behavior coursework. Some can be from your undergraduate, and then some has to be from your graduate work. Then you also have to have a certain number of years working in the field, and either some published research or case studies that you can write up, and recommendation letters for folks in the field. So that's how you get your CAB or ACAB. The board certified behavior analyst is given by, I always have to remember the designations, the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. So your BCBA is given by the BACB, so to confuse you. It is very much a behavior analytic certification. So it is all about behavior analysis. It is not going to ask about ethology or things like that, although, to be a good applied animal behaviorist, you absolutely need to have a knowledge beyond behavior analysis. You need to know your animal's ethology, how to be safe around them, their normal behaviors, their normal social behaviors, all of that. But the BCBA is restricted to behavior analysis. It's even further restricted to work with humans. So even though those principles that we use with humans are the exact same principles we use with our animals, and our humans and our animals learn the same way with some, as you said, minor species variations, some individual variations, the principles hold across species. But that, the BCBA is for work with humans, and it has become really restricted that way, partly because they've been successful at ensuring that folks that need behavior analytic services have to go to a BCBA. So there's like legislation. So they really have prevented sort of the animal folks from getting in there. So to get my BCBA when I was at the University of Florida, my last year there for my PhD, it was a very strong behavior analytic program, and we had several labs there that I went and worked with humans in to earn I had to work 1,500 hours with humans to get to be eligible for the BCBA, and then take an exam and have my coursework. So I did that while I was at Florida, and while I don't necessarily work with humans in that way, I certainly still work with humans, when I'm working with shelter staff or owners or things like that, as does anyone that works with animals. There's human work involved as well. So I can certainly use those principles. But part of the reason I got the BCBA was I think it's just useful to know how other people apply it with different species like humans. And I think it gives me a broader view of how our principles can be applied, how we can better apply them, things like that. So there are a number of folks that are in a behavior analytic field that want to or have earned their BCBA and then want to get into the applied animal field. Well, that BCBA is a great start for making sure you know basic training principles, stimulus control, Pavlovian conditioning, things like that. To get into the applied animal field, we still need, you'd still have to go and get some training in ethology and things like that. So a lot of, I think, folks, probably the certified applied animal behaviorist might be the more appropriate path. When somebody has a BCBA, I oftentimes encourage them to try and get the coursework that they would need to get their CAB as well, because I think that coursework gives them a broader view of these different species.
Yeah, certainly. And for any listeners that may be curious about this, when you have an ACAB or a CAB, what sort of day-to-day work can you use those certifications for?
Yeah, so, and that's a great question, because I didn't mention that our CABs is actually kind of a broad category. It's anybody that's doing applied animal work. And while I'm an applied animal behavior professional with companion and mostly domesticated species, there's certainly folks like yourselves that work in zoos that are behavior professionals there and could hold a CAB. There are folks that are doing conservation work with species out in the wild, and they're technically doing applied animal behavior work. And so I think in the past it's been sort of narrowly viewed that we are just, the dog and horse trainers and cat trainers. But it's actually a much broader field, and we certainly welcome all those folks to join in the CAB domain. And so we're trying to make sure that the umbrella, which is big, is noted that it's a big umbrella. So anyway, I don't think I quite answered your question. I was telling. So let me take a step back. So in terms of things you can do then with those designations, certainly working in companion animals, equine, being a behavior consultant, certainly on the books, and a lot of folks do, or working in shelters. There are other folks that might work in zoos or, as I mentioned, in conservation fields. So anything where you're really trying to improve the lives of animals or the lives of the people who interact with them, you're probably doing applied animal behavior work. Our field is largely unregulated, so while it's nice to have a cab or a cab, you can probably get to where you want to go and through other paths as well.
In your opinion, do you feel like the field would benefit from more regulations, or do you think regulations would have the opposite effect of putting too many barriers? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm really of the opinion, at least from the dog world, that we ought to have more tighter reins on what's going on. I think there are a lot of animals that are harmed by people that really don't know what they're doing, don't know what the alternatives are, can't read the stress signals in their animals, and then go on to do a lot of damage. And I think it's really heartbreaking when you see people that want to do right by their dog, right, or whatever animal it is, and they're paying somebody to try and help them, and they have invested in this dog, and they send it to somebody that makes it worse or really severely limits that dog's life going forward. And so I think more legislation would be useful. It has to be done carefully and correctly to make sure we get the outcomes we want. But I think the kind of Wild West approach we've got so far is allowing a lot of animals to be harmed, unfortunately.
Yes, I know from my undergraduate coursework, when I was taking animal behavior courses, one of the biggest things that we did in class was we would analyze videos of different dog trainers, people that were advertising themselves as behaviorists and trainers, and then our teacher would have us pick apart essentially what they were doing wrong. And that was a big part of our education, was determining what is the misinformation that is being so widespread within the companion animal community. So since you're a teacher in your classes, how has teaching about applied animal behavior kind of expanded your perspective on the field?
Yeah, so I think it really kind of helps me hone in on what I think is important and what I want our students to take away. The activity that you described, I think, is fantastic. I think that is a big challenge in our field. I want our students to come out with precise and technical language, and I want them to know what those terms mean. And then they can also see when people misapply those terms, right? Where they're like, oh, that shock collar, it's not a positive punisher, it's an attention getter. Like, okay, we need to see the effect on the behavior, because I suspect it's not being used that way, and probably also not having that effect, even if you weren't trying to use it that way. So I really want students to know that there is a science to this. There are terms that we need to have clear to communicate well, and that they need to be aware of how people misuse those terms to either consciously or unconsciously kind of dupe the public, right? I see more and more that the public has become educated that they want positive reinforcement. They know that term, but they don't know what it necessarily looks like. And so you will see trainers that say, oh, I use positive reinforcement 99% of the time, or what have you. And when you really look at what you're doing or what they're doing, it is not. That they have, for whatever reason, convinced themselves that what they're doing is positive reinforcement. The owners, again, are trying to buy the product they want from this trainer and not getting it. So there's that. The other thing I think is just the ethical side of things that I want our students to take away, that as a trainer, as a behavior professional, the animal's welfare is a number one priority, along with the human safety. And so if we are implementing programs, training programs that are going to decrease that animal's welfare, we probably shouldn't be doing them. Or if we're doing things that are likely to elicit behaviors that are going to be dangerous and maybe harmful to the owner, or anyone else that animal comes in contact with. We shouldn't be doing that. And I think that requires knowledge of the scientific knowledge of what the side effects are from these training procedures. That there are main effects, like if I use a punisher, I can have a main effect of reducing that behavior, but I might have side effects that dog is now afraid of certain stimuli and fear can turn into aggression. So those are some of the things that I have become more and more passionate about and try and instill in our students is really an appreciation for the science and our technical language, and also our duty as being ethical trainers to, improve the welfare of our animal and any humans that are in contact with that animal.
Yeah, I loved how you brought up using and understanding technical language, because that's something that Stephanie and I talk about a lot, especially in the zoo field, about describing behaviors technically to discuss a situation around an animal, because I know we're humans, so we're trying to connect with other humans by maybe using more colloquial or anecdotal language to try to describe exactly what you're seeing, but that can actually end up harming the animal because we're not using technical language that doesn't have those anecdotal assumptions or those misunderstandings, or using language that can be misconstrued or not fully understood.
Yeah, and also on the other side of that, sometimes using the technical language but without really knowing what it means, or using it and other people that you're talking to don't know what it means. And so then there's a miscommunication too of what exactly does that acronym mean for that animal or for that training session as well.
Yeah. So yeah, I would totally agree that maybe something that we can all do better in the field is really focusing on going back to those basics and having those shared, understood definitions of all these technical terms that we love throwing out.
Yeah, I agree. I think that that's certainly a struggle in the companion animal field as well. And of course, we don't necessarily always have time to describe every behavioral observation in detail. And so at some point we do want to develop a shorthand, but like you said, you have to make sure that who you're talking to has the same shorthand, right? So if I say the dog is reactive, you know what I mean by reactive, right? We have a shared definition of that. And it's when we talk to somebody that doesn't have that shared definition that, like you said, then things can get morphed and the approach to the animal might change, not be helpful to it. And I also appreciated your comment about making sure our learner understands our terms. And so while I want our students to have this technical language that they can use with other behavior professionals and scientists, when we talk to the public, we do have to have a second language, right? We can pepper in our technical terms, but we either need to define them or we need to kind of align them with terms that they already know. So, in behavior analysis, we're sort of infamous for having lots of very technical terms like establishing operation, which is pretty technical and it's hard. It can be a hard concept to wrap your head around, but I can communicate most of what that means by saying motivation, and then people understand that. So I think as behavior professionals, we really have to have two languages, right? One is our scientific professional language, and then one that we have to be able to communicate with our owners, our public, and so making sure that we're using terms that they're comfortable with as well.
Yeah, I love that.
So when we like to wrap up these interviews with you all, we love to ask what everybody is curious about right now. So what's something that you are curious about going on in the world, or something you're researching? It can be related to what you're studying or not.
As probably you do too, right? You just love watching your animals and thinking about what they're processing and what's driving their behavior. One of the things that I've always been fascinated with is what are some sort of natural behaviors that might be reinforcing to our animals. And I think about this of cats getting to jump up high on things, that I suspect access to those high things is a reinforcer. And that's a broader question, just really how do those basic behavioral principles that I've studied a lot, like reinforcement, tie into these sort of ethological behaviors that we see, that, where do those connect? So thinking about these sort of what we consider natural behaviors that I suspect actually getting to engage in those might be reinforcing for the animal themselves. And we could use them essentially in training if we wanted to, right? That if we needed our cat to maybe take some medicine, contingent on taking the medicine, they could have access to their cat tree to jump up it. Along those same lines, I'm interested in dogs and smelling and their odor detection. We have my graduate student, Sally Dickinson, that I mentioned before, is working with us and with our colleagues at Texas Tech on training average companion dogs to detect the invasive spotted lanternfly egg masses, and she's been really successful with that. We should have some papers out soon. We have some papers from Texas Tech's lab out already on that, but we'll have our citizen science or participatory science out soon. But along those lines, I just think it's fascinating to think, does getting to smell and getting to smell new things, are those reinforcers for our dogs? So could I essentially train my dog using access to novel smells? And, what smells are more reinforcing? If they smell like a fox smell, is that going to be more reinforcing or more fun for them to smell than just like a cleaning product, right? So again, thinking about how their natural behaviors kind of tie into reinforcers that might maintain other behaviors. So I would be interested in exploring whether certain dogs find certain smells reinforcing in and of themselves without pairing that smell with food or a toy. And if certain breeds like hounds maybe find those smells more reinforcing than like sight hounds, those would be fun things to explore.
Yeah, that's great. So many questions and then still so much stuff that we still don't know the answer to. It's so exciting. I love it. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And I know that you're also involved in the master's program at Virginia Tech. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah. So we developed in 2020 an online master's program. We have a concentration in applied animal behavior and welfare. And the program is really designed for behavior professionals that want to gain more scientific knowledge. So the program is all online. We do have synchronous components that are not required, so we always video record them, but I know it's fun to Zoom with people and see them kind of face-to-face a little bit that way, and sometimes we'll host in-person weeks where students can come out and work with us. But the program is designed to be flexible, so it's online asynchronous. And we designed the curriculum so you could be eligible for your ACAB if you wanted to. And it involves a research project along the way. And a lot of our students do thesis level research projects. And several of them have already published their work, which is great. We have, of course, a lot of folks in the program that are companion animal people that are, maybe current or aspiring behavior consultants, people that work in shelters. But we also have folks that work in zoo settings. We had someone graduate last summer that did a project with an iguana. So we have a range of behavioral professionals. I think we have great faculty. I'm the coordinator. Dr. Lisa Gunter, who I think will join on this podcast one of these days, is another major faculty member in the program. And then we have some great affiliate folks that join us. Dr. Robin Foster, Christina Spalding, Jessica Heckman, Mindy Waite, Megan Hannon. We have some veterinary behaviorists that help us out too with our curriculum.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you for listening. The link for more information about that master's program will be in all the descriptions, as well as the link to our social media. And if there's something that you are curious as a listener, please email us and we'd be happy to explore it.